When must we file the tax forms? This is often unclear to taxpayers, so let's keep it simple. For all intents and purposes, all individuals are referred to as calendar year taxpayers, meaning their taxes are due mid-April. Normally, the deadline is April 15th, but if that date falls on a Saturday or Sunday, then it's the next business day. There is a discussion in your workbooks and in your supplemental reading that refers to fiscal year filers, meaning their taxes are due on a different date. In all my years of tax preparation, I have never heard of an individual who is a fiscal year taxpayer. So we'll save the fiscal year discussion for business, where it applies. There's a couple exceptions to the April 15th due date. A U.S. citizen or resident living overseas has an automatic 2-month extension. So they don't have to file on April 15th. They have to file by June 15th. Military personnel in a combat zone have 6 months after returning to the U.S. to submit their returns. So sometimes they wait a year or even a year and a half before being required to file their tax. Anyone can file for an automatic 6-month extension by using Form 4868 on or before the due date of their tax return. I know most tax practices on the 14th and 15th of April have a line of people seeking extensions. In fact, many professional preparers don't do any taxes on the 15th, just extensions. It's important to note that an extension is only an application to delay the due date of the forms, not the payment of the tax. So you must at least know if you owe taxes. If you do, you have to send the tax in with the extension. We'll cover that in more detail later. We've talked about who should file, which forms to file, and when to file and pay a return. There are 3 additional topics that I want to address briefly before we move on to the discussion regarding filing status. They are rounding, record keeping, and the taxpayer identification number, also known as the Social Security number. First, rounding. When I started as a tax preparer, tax returns were prepared to the penny. Since that time, the IRS has relaxed and even eliminated that requirement. Now, they don't want you to report beyond whole dollars. The most common technique, and the one we will use in this course, is to round down if the amount is under 49 cents and round up if the amount is 50 cents or higher. Incidentally, one of the most common questions I get is, how long do I keep my tax return? As a professional tax preparer, you should maintain copies of the returns you prepare for at least 3 years after the return was filed and advise the clients to do the same. Failure to do so could result in a tax preparer penalty. So if you did a tax return in April 2011 for tax year 2010, you need to keep it at least until April 2014. To satisfy this requirement, many professional tax preparers back up their computer and keep a digital copy on file to avoid having to maintain file cabinets or boxes full of paper copies. Furthermore, written documentation that supports the return can be scanned and kept on disk for easy retrieval. Finally, let's spend a few moments discussing the name of which the IRS knows you. It's called the Taxpayer Identification Number, but is most commonly known as the Social Security number. Everybody that is listed on a tax return must have a Social Security number, except in the rare instance of a child that is born and dies within the same year and without receiving a Social Security number. In this instance, you must attach a copy of the birth certificate and, where it says Social Security number on the tax return, mark died. The taxpayer and spouse's names and Social Security numbers must be correct or the return will be questioned by the IRS. For instance, a lady came to one of our associates stating that her name was Mrs. Adams. She said, "My tax return is getting too complex. I need someone else to do it for me." The tax preparer said, "Sure, Mrs. Adams, we can do that." She then added, "You know, it's a funny thing. Just last week I was cleaning out my dresser drawer and I found my Social Security card. You know, it still has my maiden name on it. And I've been married 25 years. My husband died 5 years ago. But I've always been known as Mrs. Adams." The tax preparer then explained, "Well, your Social Security records are still in your maiden name, so you should file under your maiden name." She said, "You have to be kidding. Why don't they change it?" To which the tax preparer replied, "Because you haven't told them that you were married." So he completed the tax return using Mrs. Adams' maiden name, and that afternoon she went to Social Security and had her name changed. The next year, he was able to use her married name. Incidentally, today, with electronic filing, if the Social Security number and the name don't match, the return will be sent back to the electronic filer and told that something is incorrect and needs to be fixed. This can delay the filing process, so it's a good idea to ensure it's right up front. To obtain a Social Security number, the taxpayer has to file a Form SS-5, and that's filed with the Social Security Administration. Often, when a new baby is born, the hospital will file the form on behalf of the parents. If the taxpayer is in the process of adopting a child for whom he cannot get a Social Security number, he can file a Form W-7A with the IRS to obtain an ATIN, Adoption Taxpayer Identification Number, for use in place of the Social Security number. Also, you may have a foreign national who is working here and was given a Social Security card for tax purposes. Now, they are bringing their family over and qualify to claim them as dependents on their tax return. However, those dependents do not have green cards and Social Security numbers. Therefore, they have to apply for Individual Taxpayer Identification Numbers, or ITINs, using Form W-7 in order to receive the exemption. Another problem you may encounter is when a client's child is born in December. If a child is born in December and you're trying to do the tax return in early January, the parents probably won't have received the Social Security card yet. Nevertheless, they can get the number by going back to the Social Security office, and upon providing them with the child's name and the date of birth, can receive a tear strip that can be used for tax purposes, even though the card isn't yet available. If the taxpayer is in the process of adopting a child, the same thing applies. They can get an ATIN, an Adoption Tax Identification Number, by using the Form W-7A. You must get these numbers from the IRS before you can process that return. By the way, contrary to what your client asks or what you have heard, the family dog or cat does not qualify for a Social Security number, regardless of how much it is loved or costs to maintain.